so much, Peter John, and thank you, Lois, for the introduction and the very warm welcome. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to be with you this morning and to talk about a topic which is very close to my heart. So as Lois mentioned in her introduction, I run a nonprofit called For the Voiceless. And the priority of For the Voiceless is to give children an opportunity to speak for themselves and also to advocate on their behalf or in concert with them, depending on their ages. So I'm going to share my screen now because I've got some slides to share with you. Can everybody see that? Lois, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. So we know that the lockdown and COVID and the pandemic that children have been experiencing over the last almost 2 years now has had a massive impact on them. And when I put together this list of some of the effects of COVID on children, I found it quite shattering. And particularly because it's not a comprehensive list. It in fact doesn't include many of the things which don't necessarily contribute towards children going missing, but issues like hunger and other issues that have really impacted children during the pandemic. However, I thought that these were important because all of them can have a significant contributing factor towards children going missing, towards children being abandoned, and towards children being trafficked. So I think the big issue to start off with is poverty. And the fact is we weren't doing particularly well prior to COVID in terms of poverty. The Children's Count website, which is an amazing resource developed by the Children's Institute in UCT, noted that over 12 million of our children are living below the poverty line or were living below the poverty line before COVID. And that's 59% of children. And we can only believe that those figures have got worse over the lockdown period, because studies like the ongoing NISCRAM study have shown a significant increase in poverty over lockdown. And as you'll see in a moment, there is a massive link between poverty and both abandonment and children going missing. We also know that, as Lois mentioned, children have been out of school, significant periods of time have been lost in terms of learning. In fact, again, NISCRAM suggests that up to a year's worth of learning has been lost. But in the context of missing children, what's also very important is those lockdown learners are sitting at home a lot of the time. And many of them are unsupervised. Many of them have very little parental support. And that is, again, a contributing factor towards them being vulnerable towards trafficking. And we also know, as Lois mentioned, that 750,000 children have not returned to school following COVID. So that is a significant increase in numbers. We weren't doing particularly well prior to lockdown. We had 250,000 children that were not at school, but now that number has increased threefold. And I've added a question there, which is, where are those children now? It's a significant question I think we need to engage with. Then we've also seen a massive increase in abuse. So Childline numbers showed a 47% increase in the number of calls in a year period to them regarding abuse situations. And unfortunately, that's probably only the tip of the iceberg. There were a number of children who would not have been able to access support through Childline and through other services. Many of those children would in the past have had abuse picked up through school, and that wasn't an option to them. But significantly, studies have shown that when there is increased poverty, when families are under greater pressure, then there is always an increase in abuse. And the pressure cooker situation of having family members at home, many of them losing their income, many of them confined to small spaces with large numbers of people, was always going to be a contributing factor towards an increase in abuse. And again, as I say, we weren't doing particularly well prior to COVID in terms of abuse. Pre-pandemic statistics show that 26% of adolescents had reported one or other form of sexual abuse. And again, that is very important because crisis pregnancies are huge within this country, and crisis pregnancies are a significant factor in abandonment. And that leads us into our next point, which is the lack of access to health services. So very interestingly, when children were interviewed at a children's symposium, which was held by CRNSA, which is a coalition of the SADC countries that do advocacy work for all of children in SADC countries, children in South Africa mentioned a lack of access to health services, which includes a lack of access to birth control and contraceptions. And so while this is a wider problem, we know that children have missed out on mandatory vaccinations and other healthcare services. The fact is that we know that a number of young people and even older people who would have made responsible decisions with regards to contraception weren't able to access that during lockdown. And so that was a significant contributing factor towards those horrific numbers that we've seen coming out, particularly from Gauteng, where we saw 23,000 teenage pregnancies over the last year. And again, this links into abandonment. So abandonment is one of those issues that we can't actually say how big the problem is. And interestingly enough, government has disputed the fact that there was an increase in abandonment over lockdown. However, the fact is we have never had adequate statistics with regards to abandonment. So we actually have no baseline against which to measure whether abandonment has increased or not. However, because the key contributing factors to abandonment in South Africa are poverty and abuse, if those increase, it is logical to say that abandonment has increased. And certainly baby homes and those individuals who are working with abandoned children have seen a significant increase in abandonment. And specifically, and I think this is one of the things which has been most shocking, is that it's often been the abandonment of older children. So one of the stories that I told in an article that I wrote in 2020 was of a 2-year-old little boy who was found in a dustbin outside of a hospital in the coldest months of lockdown. And that was one of those stories which was just, for me, it was just heartbreaking and hair-raising, because although any abandonment is horrific, a 2-year-old child knows what they're experiencing and must have been painfully aware of that moment of his mom putting him in the dustbin. There was also a very, very sad story that Door of Hope told about a little boy called Ezra, who was found again on a very cold night during lockdown. He was in a hole next to the Joe Slovo highway. He was found, unusually for an abandonment, he was dressed in a baby grow and had a little blankie. But although he was miraculously rescued by some homeless people and police services, he unfortunately, about 6 weeks later, passed away due to complications as a result of his abandonment. So although we can't necessarily say how big the problem is, our belief is that lockdown and the pandemic has made it far greater. Orphaning is also an extremely high and significant problem within South Africa. So many of you would have had access to the Lancet study, which was published quite recently, which showed very shocking figures as far as South Africa was concerned. South Africa was placed second of all the countries that were studied, only second to Peru, in terms of the number of children who'd lost their primary caregiver. And that is as a result of the COVID pandemic. And what is very interesting in this study is that, so it's hard to compare to some other African countries, because certainly South Africa's death statistics are more comprehensive than others. But however, having said that, we know that we already had a crisis in many children not being placed in family care. And now that crisis has slightly increased because the primary caregivers have passed away. The number that the Lancet study suggested is as many as 95,000 children who've lost their primary caregiver through the COVID pandemic. What is very interesting is that during question times at Parliament, the IFP asked the Department of Social Development if they were aware of the study and if they had done similar studies, and they mentioned specifically that they weren't and that they hadn't. So the department doesn't have a contingency plan with regards to how we're going to take care of those children. And although many of them, as with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, many of them will be in extended family care and kinship care, the fact is that in many cases that care had already been stretched through over time, through poverty, through urbanization, and now we're placing an even more significant burden on those resources to care for those children. We also know that it may end up leading to institutional care, which is certainly not optimal in terms of children's neurodevelopment, in terms of their psychological well-being. And interestingly, as you'll see going forwards, that it also has an impact on their ability to things like runaways and missing children also increase when you've got institutional care. There was a huge negative impact on children's mental health, which has been significantly detailed, increases in anxiety, worry, and depression. And that also is interesting because when you've got children who spend too much time on devices as well, then that can lead into them seeking solace through device time. Now, all of these things are contributing factors towards missing children. So if we look at every single one of them, linking poverty to abandonment, the fact is we have a number of families in this country who have been deemed too poor to parent, which is horrific. So parents are having to make invidious decisions where they're having to place additional children into care, but many of them don't feel like they've got that option, so they have abandoned them. There's also an increase in sale of children. Some of the most fascinating studies show that when people are under pressure, that is a time when they start to covertly sell them into child labor. You've got exploitation, sexual exploitation. There are horrific stories about children who haven't been reported as runaways because, as they term it, it was just another mouth to feed, and their parents were simply not able to take care of them. And so many of them are not reported missing. And during a series that I wrote for the Isu Elihle competition on missing children, I had a category called ghost children. And those are children who are missing, but we don't know that they're missing. And many of those children have ended up in child labor or sexual exploitation. The Department of Labor produced figures for us for the articles that said we have about 571,000 children who are in child labor, of whom almost 200,000 are children who are being exposed to one or other hazardous situation. In addition, there's an increase in harmful cultural practices, and one of those is the practice of ukutwala, where it's kind of basically an abridged version of marriage, and it used to be consensual, but now there are stories of children as young as 14 being abducted for child marriages. And one of the most shocking statistics that I encountered during my research was that in 2017, there were 91,000 children who were either married, divorced, that's between the ages of 12 or 17, married, divorced, widowed, separated, or living as a husband or wife with a partner. And we also see an increase in muti-related crimes when poverty increases. And some of the most horrific stories that I encountered during my research related to children and muti, in particular a story where a grandmother actually sold her grandson, who was severely disabled, sold him to a sangoma for muti so she could pay for her daughter's funeral when she passed away. As I mentioned, the home alone children are particularly vulnerable. So although platooning was supposed to have ended, infrastructure in the education system is not supporting many children going back to school permanently. And so as a result, if you go through any township on any given day, you will find thousands of children who are not in school. And that is putting them in significant danger. I mentioned the loss of primary caregivers, which is also a contributing factor. And also, very interestingly enough, children have identified the failure of Ubuntu as being one of the things which has made them most vulnerable. So parents have grown up believing that they could just leave their children with somebody in the community and they would be cared for. But often that is not the case anymore. Those children are made particularly vulnerable because not all of those people are trustworthy. And I mentioned the link to stranger danger here. So although stranger danger is one of the key things we teach our children when it comes to them going missing, the fact is that, that in many cases it's people that they know, and it's community people who have been complicit in them going away. And also, so runaways is probably the most kind of noted, and it's the biggest category of children who go missing. But not all children run away just because they are going towards something, the so-called pull factors of a boyfriend or drug addiction or something like that. Many of them are pushed out of the home because of abuse. And Bianca, who you're going to hear from in a moment, encourages us to always chase the reason as to why children run away. Often abuse is a contributing factor, and they're not getting support. I mentioned psychological vulnerability. So even children who are not impoverished are being targeted online by predators, and depression and anxiety is a contributing factor. So as far as abandonment and baby sales, that is something which we probably don't have time to get into in great detail. But what I can say is that when we only try to address horror teen pregnancy strats with education, we are being short-sighted, because the fact is, until we can deal with the number of children who are abused and fall pregnant as a result of rape, and also until such time as we can deal with the fact that children who are 18 and younger can't place their children into the child protection system without parental consent, we are likely to still see children being abandoned. What is very scary is that many of those children are being absorbed into communities, so they're not even making it into the child protection system, and that's often even through authorities, including the SAPS. And we are also seeing a huge increase now in Facebook pages advertising available babies. So mothers saying that they are willing to give their baby up for a reasonable cost. And these are on public sites, and then being approached by people who would like to do that. So what do children say? These are some of the quotes that I gathered during my Missing Children SA series. Some of them are really deeply traumatic. Sichle is a child who was born with albinism. She speaks about the fact that she's been targeted by people trying to abduct her. Tertia, it's not her real name. Her story comes from a real court case where she was trafficked multiple times and just sold by many people. And interestingly, she had originally run away from a children's home, and after she ran away, she was actually kidnapped, and the kidnappers used her previous runaway as an excuse for people not to look for her, and they didn't look for her. Sipkazi's quote is also deeply distressing. The fact is that he's a 14-year-old who understands that she's not safe in her local public park because she could be raped or abducted, taken for her private parts, taken for traditional medicine. But I want to now move on to some solutions very quickly because I'm actually running out of time. And the last two quotes are the important segue into that. The fact is that children themselves identified particularly parental care as being a way that they could avoid going missing and being hurt. So in terms of solutions, we've got 3 levels of solutions. Again, I would need a lot more time to speak about this, and maybe it's something that we can speak about during the question and answer time. But critically, family solutions are so important. We need to be able to create strong communities through strong family units. Then we need more positive community input in terms of education, in terms of accountability. Then particularly we need education around issues like traditional medicine, harmful traditional practices, keeping children safe, the questions about things like Ubuntu. And then finally, what we need is we need government intervention. Because one of the things which came through very clearly in my studies was that government creates the infrastructure, children safe. And although we have a really robust legislative framework, we are very poor. Things which came out very strongly in our research is that we do not have adequate statistics. And what we need is adequate statistics in order to see how big the challenges are. And we need social development, home affairs, SAPS, the education department, and in fact, the whole ambit of government to be able to put in place the right strategies to deal with child marriage, to deal with our porous borders, to deal with the fact that we have inadequate biometrics to be able to identify children. We need to deal with corruption within the SAPS. Education needs to deal with infrastructure. And it's one of the things that children put forward very strongly. I'm going to end it at this point. As I say, we can pick it up more in the questions because I've already gone over my time. But I would like to say in closing, one of the most significant articles that I read about, studies that I read about missing children and particularly about trafficked children, was that the biggest contributing factor was poverty. The second biggest contributing factor was broken families and institutional care. And then there were other contributing factors, which included foreign children and other things. But I can say very categorically that if we are to look at ending this problem, we need to look at ending poverty and inequality, which is a big challenge, and we need to look at building stronger families. And I thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Robyn. That was hugely insightful, quite a tour de force of the area. I'm going to ask our second presenter, Bianca, to share her insights and present her thoughts to us now. You're very welcome, Bianca. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Peter John, and thanks so much, Robyn, for a wonderful presentation introducing the big problem of children going missing in South Africa. I'm Bianca, and I'm the National Coordinator for Missing Children South Africa. We are a non-profit organization, as Lewis mentioned, that assists with all missing persons cases throughout South Africa. So we deal with children's cases as well as adult cases. Now, unfortunately, this has been a problem for many years where children go missing for various reasons in South Africa. But unfortunately, due to COVID, we've seen an increase of cases where human trafficking was related. As Robyn mentioned earlier, children being sold off by their own parents due to poverty. So there's a lot of influence that has come from COVID-19 and the impact it's had on children that go missing. But just as a starting point, I would like to just explain why children go missing, the different types of cases that we deal with. Also, Robyn has mentioned this, and that is one of the facts of children that run away from home. So this is due to abuse. We've seen a lot of bullying happening at school, and then also problems at home that is not addressed. Then we've also got children that are kidnapped. Now, kidnappings also happen for various reasons. So when we say that a child has been kidnapped, it's not just a normal or just a general of that can be noted as just a kidnapping. So there's different reasons why kidnappings happen. We deal with parental abductions. We deal with opportunistic kidnappings. We deal with kidnappings for ransom. Then we have our human trafficking. So these are the prominent kidnappings that we deal basically in the organization. And as you all know, recently we've got a case of 4 brothers that have been kidnapped. Unfortunately, this is still under investigation and the boys have still not been found. And we're really praying that these boys are found safely soon. But especially if we look at our parental abductions that happen. And this is also a sad reality of involving a child and it's not necessary, putting them through the trauma that is not needed, especially when parents are getting divorced or there's custody battles. One of the parents usually kidnaps the child to get back at their spouse. And this is very traumatic for the children. And it's not necessary to put them through this because it's something between the parents. It's got nothing to do with the child, actually. And then the child also, they kind of see that the future of what a marriage is supposed to be, what life is supposed to be, is much different. They see the view much differently. So then also when it comes to our opportunistic kidnappings, these are kidnappings that happen for reasons that are only known once the investigation has been done. So we've seen an increase in kidnappings that happen actually not from stranger danger, as Robyn mentioned. Yes, strangers are still a threat to our children. So we still teach them, do not take sweets from strangers, do not get into a car with someone that you don't know. But unfortunately, in the last few years, we have seen an increase of cases where the perpetrator is known to the child. So we've seen that it is family members, it is people in the community, it's family friends. The child feels safe with this person. And unfortunately, that safety is harmful to them. So we do note to the parents to please be vigilant on the red flags when it comes to certain cases like this, where inappropriate touching of a child, too much attention towards a certain child, inappropriate comments being made. If a child comes to you and they tell you that they feel uncomfortable with a certain person, they need to listen because it could save a child's life. As if a child is uncomfortable, that it means something. There's something behind that. So we need to listen to them. We need to look out for these red flags, and we need to keep our children safe. Yes, as I mentioned, strangers are also part of the opportunistic kidnapping, especially when it comes to our shopping malls, down at the beaches, especially over festive season. We do see an increase of cases of children going missing. Now, recently I had a congress where we touched on the subject of human trafficking. And I think that is something that I really want to discuss today with everybody, because this is something that has really escalated because of COVID-19. Things have changed since COVID-19 has hit the world, not just South Africa, but has hit the world. Everything has changed. Our lives has changed from being outside, gatherings, getting together, proper conferences face to face, but now everything has changed to online, especially like now, like the webinar we're doing right now. Everything is being online, and online is what has become a threat to children and to people becoming vulnerable for human trafficking victims. So human trafficking happens also for various reasons. We've got sex trafficking, we've got forced labor, we've got child marriages, illegal adoption, and then also slavery. There has been an increase in cases since COVID, and the US Department of State has actually declared South Africa as a human trafficking hub, especially Cape Town, Bloemfontein, and Durban. Unfortunately, poverty has really increased this due to people suffering job losses, people out of desperation. So we've seen a lot of increase in false job advertisements. We've seen modeling contracts being put out there, and people are actually applying for this out of desperation and falling victim to human trafficking. So human trafficking is not just happening where victims are taken from South Africa out of our country, but we've got victims that are brought into our country and victims that are in transit within our country that are used as trafficking victims. Unfortunately, only a small percentage of the human trafficking victims are ever found worldwide. It's also becoming the largest criminal industry in the world. Just to give an example, the human trafficking industry is about $150 billion industry, where Starbucks only generates $23 million a year. So that just goes to show the amount of money that is generated from human trafficking. And if there's a need for something, there'll always be money. So we as an organization are standing strong in the fight against human trafficking. Just to give an example, that we recently had a case of a young woman, it was about a year ago. She applied online for a modeling contract in Dubai. Unfortunately, they took her. She was taken overseas. She was taken to Dubai. When she got there, all her paperwork, documentations, ID, passport was taken away. Luckily for her, she was able to get hold of a cell phone, one of the kidnappers' cell phone, and she was able to contact authorities, and she was rescued and brought back to South Africa. And that's one of a little of these victims that are ever found. We also dealt with a situation, and this is not just children that are vulnerable to the fact of human trafficking, but adults too, as in the case of this girl. I think she was 23 years old, if I'm not mistaken. But then also there's a myth about boys and girls when it comes to human trafficking. Boys are just as vulnerable to human trafficking, especially when it comes to the forced labor and slavery part. We also dealt with a case almost 2 years ago where a 13-year-old boy was actually taken. We were searching for him everywhere, and about 3 months later, he was actually found down in a mine shaft with 30 other boys, where they were kept, they were beaten. When they were found, they were malnourished, they were dehydrated, they were in a very bad condition. And they were actually all kept there to be taken out of our country for forced labor. So one of the things we've also seen during COVID with the online is especially teenagers being online schooling, being on social media. Now, social media, as much as it helps us as an organization to get the message out there of a child that has gone missing by our flyer, and also putting out some safety tips and everything regarding a child that's gone missing, as much it poses a danger to our children. We've got false profiles that are created on social media networks. Children are being invited to certain groups and grooming starts. Unfortunately, this grooming goes over a period of time. And as soon as that grooming period is done, the child is taken. So we as parents have the obligation to monitor our children's social media use, what they're busy with on social media, who they are befriending on social media. This poses a massive danger to our children. Also, what has made things quite, and this is quite an interesting thing, if we look at the whole impact of COVID, not just with human trafficking, but also with children that go missing. And that is the fact of wearing a mask. It's made it very difficult in the search of a missing person or child or human trafficking victim. So wearing a mask has actually disguised people. So we always put a flyer out of a face of a child that is missing and the known features of what we are looking for. Things have made the mask thing has made it very difficult to spot a child walking on the street with a mask on. So COVID has had a major impact on a lot of things when it comes to children and people going missing. But yes, in 2013, the Missing Persons Bureau of South Africa put out that a child goes missing every 5 hours in South Africa. Unfortunately, no new stats has been released. And it's really time that new stats on the amount of children that are going missing in our country are released. As a lot of them, and as Robyn also mentioned, a lot of them actually go undocumented or not reported as missing. Especially now with poverty, that we have desperate families that are selling off their own children for money. So those children aren't even reported as missing. So just in general, when it comes to children that go missing, there's so many threats against our children. and against our people at the moment with COVID. So there's a big impact that we as South Africa can make into keeping our children safe, is to stand up, educate our communities, educating our parents on how to keep our children safe. And I think one of the most important things that I always mention is we're living in a rushed life. We're running past each other. We don't make time for each other anymore. Those sitting at a dinner table at night, putting a cell phone down, speaking to each other, finding out what's going on in your child's life is of utmost importance. There might just be something small that you pick up that might make that difference. Also, when it comes to a child's behavior, if you see any notable changes, that's something to look into. If there's problems at school, if they're being bullied, it's something that needs to be addressed, because that might also be a cause for your child to run away. And we've also seen a higher impact or a higher number of suicides during COVID. So just some general safety tips from our side, from Missing Children South Africa, on how to keep your children safe and how to keep yourself safe. I'm going to start with the human trafficking aspect, is always to make sure that when applying for an online job, to make sure that the company is legit, to tell someone that you're going for an interview, where you're going for the interview to, who you're meeting, and what time you'll be back. Also make sure that you never meet someone in an isolated area. Always meet in a public place where there are other people around. Make sure that the interview is scheduled with the company. Make sure that the company is registered. This is just something small that could really save your life. Also, when it comes to human trafficking, read the fine print on the websites. Recently, it was quite interesting. One of the other organizations that stand in the fight against human trafficking actually created a website where they were advertising modeling contracts. And right at the bottom, they had in very fine print that this is actually a human trafficking website, but nobody read it. And they had so many people apply immediately for these job offers, but as soon as you submitted, a pop-up came up to say that you could have just been a human trafficking victim. So it's just to create awareness on how quickly this could actually happen. As I mentioned earlier, we're approaching the festive season. School holidays is on their way. So we need to keep our children safe. These are times that children are more vulnerable in going missing, especially young children down at our beaches, in our shopping malls that disappear. And those perpetrators that see these opportunistic opportunities of a child wandering off by themselves is there. So over the festive season, when going down to the beaches, going to the malls, make sure that especially young children are dressed in brightly colored clothes, so they're easily spotted in a crowd of people. Young children are inquisitive. They disappear within seconds. They see a toy in the toy aisle and they run off just to go see what there is. So it happens in seconds. Our teenagers, we call it the buddy system, always stay in a group of friends. Never go anywhere alone, especially to public restrooms. Always tell your parents where you're going, whom you're going with, and parents, this is also an obligation from your side to find out where your children are at all time, whom they're with, the parents of the other children. This is very important. Then we've also got the procedure to follow, and this is also something that has become a thing over the past years, where people still believe they have to wait 24 hours before reporting a person as missing. This does not exist. A case needs to be opened immediately with your nearest police station. This is a myth that there's a waiting period of 24 hours. The quicker a case has been opened, and the quicker action can be taken, especially when it comes to a child, because our first 24 hours to 48 hours when a child goes missing is crucial, especially when it comes to our human trafficking victims. When a child or a person goes missing, After that 48 hours, the child or person can be anywhere in the world. So if it gets reported immediately, action can be taken and the person or the child can be found safely soon. It's called the SAPS 55 form that needs to be opened with your nearest police station. We've also got what we call an interim ID kit that's available on our website to download by Parents for Safekeeping. It's a form where you fill in all the necessary details of your child: hair color, eye color, height, weight, have a photograph, and we ask parents to please update this yearly, because obviously your child's height and weight changes over the years, and also their age. So update this, keep this for safekeeping in your handbag or one copy at home. And as soon as if you have to find yourself in a time of crisis where your child has gone missing, you've got all the necessary information on hand that's needed for the missing persons case to be opened. Now, Missing Children South Africa, as I mentioned, is a non-profit organization, and we insist with all these cases, and we've got cold cases dating back to 1988 that still up until today, unfortunately, has not been solved. We've got a success rate of 77% in finding our children that go missing, but unfortunately, 23% of those are either never found or found deceased. But we need the help of South Africa to back us as an organization, to help and support us, to keep our doors open and to keep on assisting these families who have missing loved ones. It's always heartbreaking, especially this time of year where we're approaching Christmas, where a lot of families are sitting not knowing where their children are, not knowing where their loved ones are, knowing that they're going to spend Christmas, still not knowing years later. And we as an organization wants to make a difference in that. So we're refeaturing our cold cases. We never give up on a cold case. We always refeature that, try and follow up on some leads that come in. Someone knows something. So we always make sure that it gets refeatured so we can just give some closure to the family. Well, we've got some wonderful safety tips also on our website. Our website is www.missingchildren.org.za. We've got some wonderful safety tips there for parents, for children, and then also for the school holiday period. So we as South Africa have the obligation to keep our children safe. Parents need to educate themselves on child safety. They need to educate their children on how to keep themselves safe. Educate yourself on the possibilities of human trafficking, what's going on in our country. Unfortunately, kidnappings have also become a nicky and has been escalating. We need to keep our children safe. If we don't keep our children safe, South Africa will have no future. Thank you very much.